Oh, what is it now? I'm trying to fix China's economy. Wait, opium crisis? 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 I don't think the game knows what a crisis is. We don't have a crisis in our moment of triumph. No, I think we're going to continue the opium trade and become even better at it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Counterfactual Gaming, the web series where we take a historical event or a canonical event in a fictional setting and we put it in a video game and we do the opposite. Before we get started, if you like the content that you're seeing, go ahead and put a like and sub on the video. And if you have any suggestions on other things that I could be doing that are counterfactual in a video game, leave a comment below and let me know what you want me to try out. Or you could just leave a comment below debating whether something was actually counterfactual enough in the first place. Now, with all that out of the way, let's turn our attention to today's run, which is going to be China in Victoria 3, but we're going to be doing something a little different with opium. Now, I want to give everybody a little hint about how the structure of this video is going to go. The structure I have for these videos is usually that I'll have some sort of preview and an introduction. Then I will give a brief overview of the actual history related to whatever we're doing in the game today. And then I will show gameplay footage of me doing something different. That means that the next part of the video is going to be me talking a little bit about the history of opium use in China. Now, as you saw in my preview, you can see that I turned China into the world's largest producer of opium. But why would I be doing that, and why would that be counterfactual? Now, most people do know what the Opium Wars are. And most people do have some understanding of the opium trade in China and the two opium wars that were fought about that. But I want to go into a little more detail about actual imports and production of opium in China. Because when I started reading some historical stuff related to the opium wars, what I discovered is that the history of opium in 19th century China is a little more complicated than just looking at the two opium wars and saying, oh, I guess that's all that happened. It's a little more complicated than that. But in order to talk about opium in China, we first have to talk about opium growth in British India. Certain parts of India in the 19th century, and even today, are prime areas for growing the poppy, which is used to make opium. By some accounts, by the end of the 19th century, almost 10 million people in India were involved in growing poppies for use in the opium trade. This was, of course, done through the East India Company, which had a special charter granting it a monopoly over businesses within Asia, including this opium trade. Now, there's a whole other fascinating historical thing to talk about with just how opium was grown in India, under what economic and agricultural conditions. But what's important for us is that it was a large commodity for export in terms of amount. As the century wore on, more and more people were involved in opium cultivation in India. And this product wasn't just something being consumed in the British Empire, it would need exporting somewhere else. Now, prior to the 19th century, the East India Company had still been importing stuff into China despite a ban on imports. And because of the other trade that was happening with China, between the British economy, including British India and China, there were some issues with a trade deficit that could only be made up for by increasing opium exports to China, despite the ban that had been in place for years. Another consideration, which I didn't know till I'd read up on it, was that the East India Company itself had been in some serious debt after wars to take over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1764. And so in order to make up these trade deficits and financial shortfalls, a number of schemes were used by the East India Company to get opium into China despite official bans being in place. One of the difficulties, though, was that even though it was technically illegal, even in the 1830s, there was widespread use of opium throughout Chinese society. Not just addicts who were poor and in the streets, but we're talking like people in higher positions in society as well. And by the 1830s, China now had a trade deficit with the British economy, as opposed to the previous situation where the British economy had a trade deficit with the Chinese economy. Combined with some of the detrimental effects of widespread opium use, there was an increasing effort by the Chinese government to not just make opium illegal, but to actually end the trade. These practices would, of course, lead to the First Opium War, which Britain would win. Britain would gain special trade concessions and would be able to continue exporting opium from India to China. But that's not the end of the story. Yes, there was a second opium war, but when you look at what was happening with opium consumption and production in China, what ends up happening is that towards the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an increase in domestic production of opium in China. This was interesting to me because I didn't realize that by 1901, there was enough domestic production of opium in China that it was hurting British sales of opium from India. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, we don't have so much an opium problem in China where it's, oh no, foreign drug dealers are destroying our country, where instead it's, oh no, we have an economic problem because now there's so much opium, it's putting other opium dealers out of business. To the point where in 1907, Britain signs a treaty with China, gradually agreeing to eliminate opium exports while China agreed to eliminate domestic production. And so the two countries that had fought a war over opium almost a century ago were now signing a deal to cut down both sides' opium production. Now, it's understandable why the Chinese government would have wanted to cut down on opium use. It caused a lot of societal problems. It caused economic problems. We could discuss on a different day the value of a prohibitionist policy towards drugs in general. But what I wanted to point out for our purposes today is that China as a country, with her borders even in 1836, has the capability of producing her own opium. Her people don't have to buy it from India if they make enough domestically. And that's going to be the central focus of today's game, where we're not going to fight a war with Britain over opium. We're not going to try to stop the opium trade. We're not going to even try and restrict opium access among our own people. Instead, we're going to go the entirely opposite direction. If the people in China want opium, we're going to plant opium in the opium-producing parts of China and make ourselves money. Not only that, but using the new autonomous investment rules and the new way that the investment pool is utilized, those very profitable opium plantations will be contributing a significant percentage of money to my investment pool, which will help fuel the industrialization of China. In other words, we're going to outproduce the British a century early, and we're going to use that as a tool to make China a leader in terms of industrial output. So today, my challenge will be very simple. I'm going to try and make China the number one producer of opium by September of 1842. Why did I pick that date? Well, the First Opium War begins at the very end of August 1842. So by my reckoning, the most counterfactual thing I can do is, instead of antagonizing the British and trying to prohibit the opium trade, I'm going to instead become the world's biggest producer of opium. But in order to do that, we're going to have to do some things that would seem counterintuitive. Because China in the Beta 1.2 patch only starts with 17 construction points that can upgrade to 34 construction points if you swap production methods to a better one, China doesn't have enough construction sectors to actually build an opium economy. So China is going to spend around 4 years building iron mines, tool workshops, logging camps, and stuff like that in order to actually improve her construction sectors and her ability to actually build stuff. We're also going to build a few government buildings and the requisite paper mills needed to fuel those government buildings so I can actually get tax revenue from the opium plantations in order to build more stuff later on. Now, this will seem counterintuitive because it would initially seem like, oh, okay, if you just built the plantations, you'd be fine. But as you're going to see, I'm going to spend 4 of the 6 years I have on my time limit building stuff related to construction sectors, but I'm not going to double, I'm not going to triple, but I'm going to add more than 5 times the number of construction points that I have at the game start by doing this, which means that around 1840, when I'm actually done doing all that stuff, I'll have both the money and the construction sectors to build the requisite opium plantations. We're also going to need a montage to get through 6 years of Victoria 3 gameplay, so hit the music, Johnny. Alright, now that we've got that all taken care of, let's take a look at opium production, and you can see that I've just barely edged out the East India Company to become the world's #1 producer. But what makes this interesting is you'll notice that even though I'm the world's top producer, I'm still not even meeting the demands of my own population, to say nothing of the demand in other parts of the world. I'm still getting imports from Britain. And you can tell that my opium plantations are very profitable, but there's something that's getting in the way of further expansion of opium. When you look at all the states where I'm growing opium, you can see that I have market access problems because I just don't have enough infrastructure. This is something that anyone playing China has to worry about, is because until you have railroads, only the coastal areas can really have their infrastructure improved. Now, because opium is in such high demand, there are plenty of local customers for that opium, so my market access issues aren't really impacting the profitability of those plantations. But it does mean that even if I wanted to build another 150 opium plantations, it wouldn't matter because I just don't have the infrastructure yet. Playing this out further means getting some technologies in place to build the railroads and the industry in place to build the railroads so that I can actually ship stuff everywhere it needs to go. You'll notice that the non-discriminated pops that are working these opium plantations have a really nice standard of living. You can tell that a significant percentage of their income is being spent on opium, but because they're making so much money, it doesn't matter. Opium's not destroying their lives. Grain prices are also cheap in China right now, which means, of course, that people can afford to buy their food. When we look at the aristocrats running those opium plantations, we can see that those aristocrats are really raking in the money, as we would expect them to. But I also promised that we would have opium plantations helping out with the investment pool. But if we take a look at the current tooltips, it doesn't seem like opium plantations are helping out at all. They're way down on the list. They're contributing just like a drop in the bucket compared to everything else. But there's a reason for that. The reason is that most of these opium plantations just recently finished having levels added to them, which means that their cash reserves are not full yet. When buildings don't have full cash reserves, they're not really contributing much to the investment pool. So in order to see just how much of an impact they're going to have on the economy, we're going to have to go forward in time a little bit and see what it looks like when they actually have full cash reserves. Alright, it's now a couple of months later. Those buildings have had a chance to fill up, and as we take a look, we can see that opium plantations are in the top 3 of our investment pool contributors. They're being beaten out by tea plantations because we just have more tea planted, and they're being beaten out by our subsistence farms because, well, it's China in 1843, and 90% of the population are working subsistence farms. There's nothing I can do to beat that out. But I did play the game out to the 1870s just to see how much opium could be used to drive the Chinese economy. And so I'm going to show you that save game, and we'll take a look at what kind of contributions to the investment pool opium is making after China's done a big round of industrializing. As we look at the footage, you can tell that even though I have lots of paper mills and logging camps and furniture manufactories, opium plantations are right up there at the top of my agriculture in terms of contributing money to the investment pool. Again, they're not going to be beating out subsistence farms even by the 1870s. This is China. There's only so much I can do. But investing in opium has been a net win for China in this round of Victoria 3. That wraps up our video for today. I hope you learned something a little bit about opium production in China and saw some things you can do in Victoria 3. That'll be fun and interesting. And so, until next time, I hope all of you have a great day.